Politics Network, we welcome you on behalf of the team course to our 20th webinar. It also connects as part of the FeBo project. So here we are back with FeBinars, with our FeBinars after a break of a few months during which we tried to reap the benefits of the March workshop about federalism and border management between ancient and modern times. 5 days of presentation, debates, roundtables on borders and federalization processes, mostly in Antiquity, but also in a comparative study. I would like to remind you that these webinars are part of a kind of think tank of our project. Our aim is to investigate the complexity of the dynamics affecting internal and external borders and border areas of anciently federal states. What is our big question? It is the following one. How can border wars be avoided? And how can federalization processes contribute to this? As a consequence, we need to work on hot topics in the current debate, such as the linearity of borders, the porosity of borders, the capacity of federalization processes, and supra-state allowances to implement border management policies. But also border management cultures bottom up, the relevance of cross-border activities, balance of power, and so on. These inter-federal and external borders might necessarily the approach from various different research perspectives and with different questions. FeBo organizes 2 meetings series of lectures, each with another focus, one with internal, which bears the title The Management of Internal Borders by Federal States, and the other on external borders. The title is Crossing Federal Borders, Ancient and Modern. So this webinar, today's webinar, is the 11th one of the FeBinar series Crossing Federal Borders, Ancient and Modern. Its aim is to analyze dynamics that are precisely cross-border. That is, specifically phenomena such as CBC, cross-border cooperation networks, of whatever nature, as well as categories of individuals, cross-borders, for various reasons, and this in a more or less informal or institutionalized form. This topic raises questions that are central to both ancient history and our contemporary one, such as, are national borders still effective for managing key public policy challenges in a highly interconnected world? Given recent relevant social and economic transformations, can national law address complex local and regional issues? What is meant by territorial trap and the bordering dynamics? How can CBC, that is cross-border cooperation, be used to implement territorial governance, especially in border regions? Michael Fonte will guide us these topics, starting with the research he's conducting on the EGT themes. He graduated at the University of Bolzano and specialized in political sciences and civics with a thesis on, the title is Passato, Presente e Futuro dell'autonomia altitudina sudtirolese e il controverso ruolo della clausola di maggior favore. He's now carrying out his PhD research on lo sviluppo dei GECH, che è un'abbreviazione italiana, l'acronimo italiano, no? Degli GPCA, e quindi lo sviluppo dei GECH in prospettiva di un'Unione Europea delle regioni funzionali. Il supervisor is Professor Francesco Palermo, school supervisor Nicoletta. Palermo gave the first webinar of this series, devoted to ancient and modern federalism, I guess 3 years ago or something like that. Today, Marco Fonte will give a webinar bearing the following title: Borders, Cooperation, and Territorial Governance. So please, floor is yours. Thank you.
So good evening, everyone. First of all, I want to thank you, Professor Anki, for the invitation. I'm very honored and glad to be here in this important opportunity to explain you some macro topics that I have already studied for my PhD research. And finally, I want to thank all the people who supported this important initiative. So today's lecture will be... No, okay.
We didn't share
I should share.
slide. No worries at all. This is all.
So today's lecture, as Professor Faki said, will be on these macro concepts: borders, cooperation, and territorial governance. This
So it would start next slide. Riusciamo a fare passaggio.
Honestly. Okay, so this lecture is structured in this way. So the first short part will be on geographical concepts. So 2, 3, 4 concepts that I think that are very important to understand in order to comprehend better cross-border cooperation dynamics. And these concepts are legal geography, territorial threat, and debordering and bordering dynamics. The second part will be on constitutional topics, so cross-border cooperation, territorial governance, EU governance, and finally, we will look at the region's role in the European Union. Okay. Okay. So the first concept that I wanted to analyze is the so-called legal geography. As I wrote on the slide, this concept could be considered an academic approach that studies the way of legal practices of producing geographical space. So space is a product of legal practices, as well of course as social and geographical ones. We can consider law not a technical or natural instrument, but rather functional one that defines practices and discourses within a given space. So far from being simply normative, law from this perspective is first and foremost a practice that creates spaces. Just to make it clear, legal practices are willing to organize geographical space. For example, like the establishment of borders, and to establish how space should be organized from each actors. Okay, so the second concept is the so-called territorial threat. And as Nicolini said, this concept is very important because it is a cognitive myopia that many academic authors have that supports the clear distinction between internal and external affairs and the precise coincidence between the state and the society within territorial boundaries. So, in other words, it is a distortion of the reality. Another important perspective of this concept is that this territorial threat defines the idea of a nation in terms of its people and its territory. by enclosing territories. So in other words, it could be meant as a graphic way to, that circumscribe the nation in order to mapping it. It has also a political nuance, this term. And then we will look at the prerequisites of this concept, elaborated by Agnew. The first prerequisite is based on the states considered as fixed entities in sovereign space. So this means that this prerequisite is based on the ignoring the history and the social political context that created the states and continue to shape them. Another important prerequisite is the so-called inside and outside distinction. So the strictly defining what's national versus foreign hides the many connections that exist across borders. And the last prerequisite is based on the conception of states as containers of society. So the belief that the state is an entity that came into being before society and is therefore a natural container of the latter. Last two short concepts regarding the geographical art are the so-called the bordering and bordering dynamics. So what is bordering? Bordering, as this author argued, bordering means the act of actively setting limits or confining. So the borders could be considered in this way. So no fixed points, no fixed lines. There are no fixed lines. They could be considered rather a dynamic social processes, a mix of ideas, relationships, and practices that create differences in space. So border is constantly becoming, so changing, not just being or static. So they are temporary, mobile, relational, and multi-layered sites that have shifting symbolic meanings and function within space. Then we look at the final concept of this geographical art, that is the so-called debordering dynamics. Debordering is basically the loss of social political importance of rigid national borders caused by globalization. So our societies are very interconnected, and therefore rigid national borders are not able to manage effectively many areas of our realities. Okay, so this was a very quick introduction about the geographical approach. But the longer one is the institutional topics. The first one, okay, is the so-called and the famous cross-border cooperation. What is cross-border cooperation? So the assumption of this concept is that every person belongs to various communities in the political, economic, social, and cultural, linguistic spheres at many geographical levels, as we look at the slide, local, regional, national, supranational, and or transnational levels. So now let me explain what is cross-border. Cross-border relationship, in this case, are very especially strong in Europe, largely thanks to the European integration process. In the EU, particularly through the Commission, there are very strong economic and legislative tools to drive this economic transformation at the cross-border international strength. Strattari, an important professor of this university, said that cross-border cooperation is more than just a proximity between communities across borders. It's about, in Europe in particular, joint development and implementation of policies and projects for cross-border areas. Now we look at the terminologies. So as my supervisor 2 years ago discussed this part, the first attempt to elaborate a terminology of cross-border cooperation was made in 1980 by the Council of Europe, and the first terminology used is the so-called transfrontier cooperation. So within this terminology, transfrontier cooperation has other two sub-concepts: transnational cooperation, so the cooperation between institutional authorities belonging to different countries, and the interterritorial cooperation, so the cooperation between regions that do not share necessarily a common border. Now we look at the EU level. So in the EU level, the EU law, when we talk about cross-border cooperation, we use the term territorial cooperation. And this term indicates in particular a European project called European Territorial Cooperation, that is a cohesion policy's goals in the EU. The scope is to overcome problems across borders and to jointly develop potential of the diverse territories. And these cooperation actions supported by this initiative are financed by many EU funds, but the most important one is the European Regional Development Fund. And in this European Territorial Cooperation, we have three different cooperation strands: cross-border cooperation, transnational cooperation, and interregional cooperation. So the first type of cooperation is the so-called cross-border cooperation. It belongs to the Interact program type A of the European Territorial Cooperation, and it characterized by the cooperation between regions along or near borders across at least two member states. The scope is basically to address more effective way shared challenges and use untapped growth potential in border areas, thereby fostering harmonious development of the Union. And the subject of this cooperation are innovation, mainly innovation, healthcare, education, employment, and labor mobility. The second type is the so-called transnational cooperation that belongs to the Interact Type B program. It supports collaboration across large transnational territories or sea basins. It involves many partners at different geographical scales, from EU member states as well as non-EU countries. The scope is to boost, of course, territorial integration. And in this level of cooperation, the investments are very important, particularly those related to innovation and green and digital transition. And then we have the last level of cooperation in the EU law, the so-called inter-regional cooperation, so Interreg Type C program. The main characteristics are the following. So it works at pan-European level, so covering all EU member states and partner states. It builds networks in order to develop good practice and facilitate the exchange and transfer of the successful region's experience in relation to sustainable urban development, including urban-rural linkages, and to the implementation of cooperation programs and action, as well as to the use of the famous European groupings of territorial cooperation. So this level, this tool, of course, to strive with cooperation to overcome many challenges at the present and future time. Genetic. So a little recap in order to have a better understanding of this part. So cross-border cooperation is basically a collaboration between public institutions and private actors situated in contiguous border areas. The goal is to better manage socio-economic interdependencies and address common policy challenges. And the last point is very important. So the cross-border cooperation offers new political spaces where it is possible to more effectively tackle numerous problems that cut across border regions in various fields. But what are these new political spaces? These new political spaces could be labeled as functional spaces, which do not always correspond to the political institutional territory. In these spaces, so we can see borders are considered an obstacle to the professional and social activities of the people, in particular in the professional field, of course. And then we have the so-called territorial governance. So the first assumption is that state-centric governance model of past century is problematic. We already know that. And the new governance is necessary, especially for border regions. Based also because there is a globalization interdependencies. So what is territorial governance? You can say that it is a set of models and processes implemented and based on specific political institutional conditions to manage, coordinate, and govern non-hierarchical networks made up of various actors organized at the transnational level. One of the most important types of territorial governance is the so-called multi-level governance. So this type of governance is very effective for implementing public policies tailored to local dynamics, and it can adapt itself in relation to economic, social, and cultural changes. So it helps the interaction also between different institutional levels, which otherwise struggle to coordinate easily. So there are also definitions about that. So Petroni, an important professor of this university, elaborated this definition. So multi-level governance is basically a diverse set of provision, coordination, systems, negotiations between formally independent but functionally interdependent entities which interact with each other through complex relationships which are in turn predefined by their coordination and negotiations. Another important definition is of these two authors. So multi-level governance is useful to describe the dispersion of decision-making process across multiple territorial levels. So we have multi-level term that refers to the high interdependence among institutions at different geographic scales, while the term governance indicates the strong interdependence between institutional and non-institutional actors across the various territorial levels. So regarding multi-level governance, there are many types. I choose the two most important ones. So the first is the federal governance, and the second is the functional governance. So federal governance is characterized by a rigid constitutional hierarchy and few institutional levels, a well-defined and non-overlapping competences. The function is general, so not focused on specific policy objectives or scopes. The focus is on the operation and interaction of the few internal political institutional levels, so national, regional, and local levels. And the legal framework is rigid and durable, as constitutional amendments require a complex and long procedure. Okay, and then we have the functional governance, very important to understand cross-border cooperation. So the sociological approach or assumption that is very useful to know in order to understand better this topic is that the society could be considered an organism within which individual social groups identify activities or functions of common interest and decide to work together to improve their well-being. So there is a common interest in order to cooperate. Then this kind of governance is useful and functional to carry out a specific task, which may, of course, change over time in relation to policies to be implemented and without having a territorial jurisdiction, unlike the federal governance system. So, functional form of governance could be meant as a complementary and competitive with classic rigid general purpose of institution and is characterized by having overlapping jurisdiction. I also added in the brackets that this could lead to the confusion of management of policies areas and a problem of political integrity, as national borders are considered by these actors in the functional governance and are obstacle, so a barrier. So in what form of governance is cross-border cooperation? Based on what we have seen, we can support this statement. So the cross-border cooperation could be meant as functional multi-level governance because it involves the many and various types of actors, of public and private actors at various levels. And it is created to respond to the concrete and specific public policy that afflict potentially integrated regions but are disrupted by the presence of national borders. Okay. Now we have seen the cross-border cooperation governance. It is useful also to understand the European Union governance, and what is this governance is basically could be considered as a new functional multi-level governance. So why new functional and not functional? So I want to start by mentioning the famous Schuman Declaration. In the 1950s, Schuman was a famous foreign minister of France who said that Europe will be not made at all once or according to a single plan. It will be built through concrete achievement, which first create the so-called de facto solidarity. What is this term de facto solidarity? This term is based on the so-called spillover approach. That is a process whereby, being very explain this terminology, a given action related to a specific goal creates a situation in which the original goal can be assured only by taking further actions, which in turn create a further condition and a need for more and support. So new functionalism is not classic functionalism because the integration process is not considered by new functionalism as a purely technical process. Rather, it is considered a process driven by both technical or functional dynamics and political actors. So at last, of the integration process, it is important for new functionalists the creation of supranational institutions. And why multi-level? So first, I want to clear the meaning of these terms. So rescaling. What is rescaling? Rescaling is a process of change or reorganization of levels of governance or scales. And through this rescaling, the European Union in the last decade has developed a complex set of overlapping and intertwined multi-level governance systems within which European, national, regional, and local actors coexist and interact. Okay. Now we look at the EU governance implementation. There are many types of implementation. I choose two that I consider very important. The first is the so-called partnership, and this partnership is a collective procedure that involves public institutions at European, national, regional, and local level, as well as various other economic and social actors representing civil society. It is applied throughout all the stages of programming process, as you can see of the progress, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation stages. And the scope is of this way of this example of EU governance is to facilitate, encourage the implementation of programs that require the procurement of significant economic resources or institutional strength, capacity building, and accountability of the actors relevant to the funds, as well as legitimacy, stability, and sustainability of the investment. For example, when we talk about legitimacy, we talk about the involvement of specific actors that are able to not only carry out a specific program, but to represent also part of the community. Another example of EU governance implementation is the so-called comitology. Comitology is basically a system developed in the European Union in order to manage executive details of policies that were left out of the legislative process. Comitology refers to many committees, and the composition of these committees is the following. So there are member states experts, expert representatives, and chaired by a commission representative. And the function is very useful. The function of these committees is very useful for the Council of European Union, that through these committees is able to scrutinize the Commission's activity, especially when it implements Council decisions that are not very well detailed. Also, the function uses the committees in order to gain technical knowledge from institutional and non-institutional experts in the member states, which is very important for developing community policies and creating specialized stakeholder networks. So the current law of this comitology is the following. So the committees provide valuable assistance to the Commission in exercising its executive powers, while allowing member states to maintain control over the execution of policies decided by the co-legislators. And then I wanted to add another example of EU governance, very linked to the local dynamics, and it is the so-called European Grouping of Territorial Cooperation. So it is based on this article, as a specific action in the cohesion policy of ministerial self-defense. These actions may be adopted by the European co-legislators in accordance with the ordinary legislative process after consulting the two famous committee, the Economic and Social Committee and the Committee of the Regions. The establishing regulation is the following. So we look at the characteristic then of this legal tool. So first of all, the scope. The scope is the promotion of cross-border, transnational, and interregional territorial cooperation between member states and their regional and local authorities, with the ultimate goal of strengthening the economic, social, and territorial cohesion of the European Union. But why the European grouping is so important? It is important because it is the only legal tool that has a legal personality in the cross-border cooperation field. And thanks to this aspect, it can has a staff, a budget, it is responsible for its own debts, it can issue and participate in calls for tenders, public procurement procedures, it can provide public services and manage public infrastructure. It can conclude contracts or enter into contracts. It can participate in Interact programs, so the European Territorial Cooperation programs. It can be held accountable in legal proceedings. And so, based on this aspect, we can understand very easily why this European Territorial Cooperation is very important. So we have now the so-called Euregio here in Tirolo, Sub-Tirol, Trentino. So it's important to understand the composition of this legal tool. This European grouping of territorial cooperation could be composed by member states, regional local authorities, public law entities, public enterprises, and companies providing service of general economic interest located on the territory of at least 2 member states. But however, this legal tool has a very important limit, highlighted by the EU institutions multiple times, and not only, also member kingdoms highlighted this important aspect. So based on these documents, I also wrote the identification codes of these papers. This European grouping of sector cooperation is not able to eliminate legal and administrative obstacles in cross-border contests because it cannot exercise regulatory powers. So basically, there are, I also wrote in brackets some example of legal obstacles, for example, conflicting national regulations, different level of competence of regional local authorities, or the administrative obstacles are, for example, different level of competence of the administrative counterparts. So these aspects are not easy to solve by this legal tool. So that's why the EU has already prepared another way to approach of these problems. That, of course, I don't want to leave it too much into this matter because the time is not too much. Now we have the important part of the role of regions in the European Union. As the Professor Baroncelli highlighted in 2020, in the last decade, the doctrine considered the European Union something that could be able to grow regional dimension, and so the doctrine coined the famous expression "Europe of regions." So in order to indicate an organization led by regions and not only by states. So why the regions were considered so important for the EU governance? So first of all, we have to consider the importance of regions in the EU cohesion policy. For example, the European cross-border cooperation, the European grouping of territorial cooperation are very useful to create a more integrated area and cross-border regions. But we have also to underline that it's not only about cohesion policy, the treaties of the European Union, local and regional dimension self-government systems are considered part of national identity of member states, another important aspect. And lastly, it is important to remember that actually the Committee of Region has the right to bring an action before the Court of Justice in defense of the principle of subsidiarity. So, based on not only these three aspects, but also on these three aspects, the doctrine began to think that regions could become very important in the future of the EU. However, today we are seeing that the regions are not too much important as we thought, because of many reasons. The first could be, of course, it's an opinion, the 24 European enlargement that brought many countries with a highly centric culture that view regions merely as a tool for obtaining structural funds. So these countries, particularly of course the East countries, do not have a regionalist culture. Then another important reason of the declining of the importance of EU of the regions in the EU governance is the limited relevance of the Committee of the Regions in the European decision-making process, which basically was the outcome of a compromise between who wanted a chamber of regions to act as a third assembly alongside the European Parliament and the Council, and those who rejected and are still rejecting the idea of regional representation, arguing that member states are the true master of treaties. So there are states that do not want a chamber of regions. They do not want to give to regions more importance in the EU governance system. Then another aspect is the low regional participation in the EU Council and the impossibility for the regions and local authorities to directly challenge EU legislative acts before the Court of Justice to safeguard the powers when those acts appear to violate the principle of subsidiarity. It is a contradiction because, as I wrote before, here, yes, the Committee of Regions has the right to bring an action before the Court of Justice, but the single regions in the EU cannot. So, in my opinion, it's a contradiction. And then we have other two important moments that show the declining of the importance of the regions. The first is the EU crisis, and the second is the pandemic crisis of the COVID-19 crisis. Regarding the first one, the first crisis, so we have to know that crisis concentrated budgetary power at national level, reducing regional autonomy. In detail, we can say that there was a economic and monetary union reform that introduced a more strict fiscal control mechanism, and the funding of structural funds became very linked to the EU's economic governance, so-called the European semester. And during that crisis, the Commission was able to obtain the ability to suspend cohesion funding if member states fail to comply with budgetary discipline. So regions are still depending to the member states' economic policy. So regions were and are still significantly excluded for the EU supervision mechanism, and the debt reduction goal applies to regions, but they are not involved in the decision-making process. And the second moment, as I said before, is the pandemic crisis. In contrast to the Euro crisis, this crisis brought new resources but marginalized regions from managing the most important funds. So we looked, so the EU applied a new economic policy. So austerity was not implemented anymore, and the aim of these new economic policies was, of course, to strengthen, basically mainly to strengthen the cohesion. However, cohesion was considered just a criterion for fund allocation alongside the green and digital transition, but not a principle of governance. Therefore, regions did not gain management of any recovery plan funds or programs, and the Commission and national governments are still managing everything because the recovery plan is still working. So the recovery plan governance is, you can say, is conducted by EU institutions, and regions are excluded from the EU semester, which provides the framework for the plan. So regions, unfortunately for them, are only mentioned as important partners, but practically the involvement is relegated to national regulations, resulting in a marginal role in the EU's decision-making process. So, as we said, so we are not talking anymore on Europe of regions based on the reason that I have explained, but the goal is now to reach a Europe, create a Europe with regions. So a more realistic goal. And this Europe with regions was described by these many authors, including my supervisor Palermo. So it is characterized by a participatory governance. So the so-called Europe with regions would represent a model of governance where subnational authorities actively participate in the EU legislation and policy making. The collaboration would rely on the synergy between the distinct but interactive and complementary supranational and national legal orders, and the East European with regions would be a relational structure based on complementary and cooperation among the main three levels of governance. And these three main areas of governance, each with own competences, would converge to effectively elaborate and implement public policies. Of course, in this vision of Europe, states will remain very important. So regions in the most positive situation, optimistic situation, could be important as states, but not more than states. That, okay, then, thank you very much.
Very helpful that you have sort of that this very clear overview of relevant issues concerning borders and territorial governance that the EU and beyond. So the floor is open to questions, debates, curiosities.
I know that I explained a lot of concepts, so it's not easy to elaborate. these many knowledges.
In a few minutes, but very interesting. I was reminded of that specific passage by Aristotle. I suppose recognizing the involvement of people living in border areas in the central council. Because they know problems in the border areas, problems that people living poor and not aware of works on the one side. On the other side, we also have other passages pointing to the danger to involve people in border areas because they protect enemies and protect their own territories to the neighbors, those beyond the border. So we have both perspectives. We have a future of some then we should join institutes of participants in the next 6 months working on cross-border cooperation between ancient and statistical.
I was wondering, probably there is also, do you think it depends on the fact that most of the state capitals are not along borders? There are a couple of exceptions, of course, like Antiquity of Bratislava in and so on. But most of the instances of borderlands sovereign probably not reach the center. So this is quite interesting because I was reading on the book of the writer I don't know, satellite treaties, not treaties about where founding a city in the state territory. The city capital should be always at the center because it's not, it cannot be attacked by the disease of the things. But interesting, it's just one border things that do not reach the center. I don't know. Yeah, it plays a role or not at all.
No, it plays a role because when we look at the borders, mainly we can find minorities also. And so the perspectives are very different from the central government of states and the borders regions, because also, for example, minorities that present here in Switzerland exist. In Italy, Italy is very, in my opinion, do not have this regionalist view. And when we look at the politicians in Rome, the most of them are from regions are very near to the capital, and maybe that's also very good reason to understand, a way to understand the lack of capability to understand others' needs. And so I think that it is important also to, in my opinion, to involve more persons that live in borders areas when for example, a policy regarding cross-border dynamics is implemented. So I think your point of view is very effective. I agree with you.
Then one for question two. What is the word charity in Antiquity?
But
This is the question.
the question, but we can write a book.
Yes, I know.
Question. Territory plays a very big role. I mentioned legal practices and also geographical practices. The way, for example, geographical practices organize, represent territory is crucial also to political dynamics. So, territorial is a tool of politicians to manage identities, to create some beliefs, and that's why territory. For example, I don't want to be too much focus on politics, but when we look at the war between Russia and Ukraine, the formal reason is because it wants some Ukrainian regions that were part of Russia for the Russian culture. Well, that plays a big role in the identity, many things. So we can write many books on that question subject. Next.
Involved. It's one of our doctoral students, in fact, carrying out activities not here, not here down.
Indeed, on your last observation, I was on the English political class. Do you know the supports it's still puts it once upon a time parties like the Northern League supporting such a view of Libya, for example, at the very beginning of the political movement. But nowadays, every impression, even right-wing political parties have switched to much more national approach. So, on the other hand, the left has always been very skeptical about federal procedures, because at the end of the day, socialism usually supports more centralized. So, what's the future EU? Is it being to fade apart or not?
So, in Italy, of course, as I said before, there's a very there's no regionalist culture. So, regardless of the political position, the parties are not so focused on local dynamics and regional needs. The exception is when we talk about local parties. For example, here in Atlantic Secure, there is a secure focus side. At the EU level, it depends, of course. When we talk about EU, we talk about, unfortunately, about states also, because when we talk about the European Parliament, there are unfortunately states representative of national parties. In my opinion, the future of regions in Europe will depend also to the ability of the EU to thrive in the economic terms. When the economy works, maybe that the regions could ask more money, more autonomy, and maybe that's the crucial point. I don't want to be too much technical about this matter, but the concept is that the regionalist works when at the state level, no one or just few one are suffering in an economic upset. Because when we look at the Italian situation, the political parties claim that decentralization will create unfair situations. When we hear unfair situation, it is logic to link this term to the economic field, in my opinion. I don't know if I explained it well or
Found very interesting for the discussion and the juxtaposition between, let's say, the failure of the regional prospect and the and whether this part was, of course, an area of countries that characterized by strong centralism.
That played a very important role, but not a crucial one. Also, the West countries, not all of them are regionally. So Italy is not a regionalist country. France, no. So Germany, yes, but we can count Germany, Austria, not too much Spain. But so, like as I said before, we can only hope for better future in economic terms, and when we live in a better economic condition, maybe we will see a more important role of provinces, as my opinion.
That's our caption to my point. Again, the breathing is very important. Bring up topic which is by the way one of the essential our project and reminder our next webinar will be even in technology and shall shop experts are on question what is the signing leader on common or federal borders in Italy at the pool of 2 common institutions on November the 5th. Okay. While on November the 30th, we will present together with Daniel Fuzzi our database on border wars, combo contrast borders. And the title is Crossing Knowledge and Laying Borders on what's happening in what's people know us in that was. So it's
And thank you for the invitation.
right. Now,